Good morning. I'll call to order the regular meeting of our Zoning and Planning Committee. Today is May 18th, 2017. I'm Lisa Bender. I chair the committee. And we have a quorum of the committee today with Council members Reich, Goodman, and Council President Johnson. We have 8 items on our agenda today. We typically go through the consent items first, and that's items 3 through 6. I'll just note we have 2 public hearings, and then the 2 discussion items that are listed are related to those 2 public hearing items, and that's why they are on discussion. So item number 3 is approving a rezoning for Minnehaha Crossing to allow for a new school. Item number 4 is approving an application for the Malcolm Yards Comprehensive Plan Amendment to allow for, which is extending the boundary of the Southeast Minneapolis Industrial Employment District to exclude 9.44 acres of property. Item number 5 is referring to a staff and ordinance related to zoning regulations for sexually oriented uses and places of adult entertainment. And item number 6 is referring to staff and ordinance amending our code related to the regulation of telecom antennas. So I'll move items 3 through 6. I'll see if anyone wants to pull any of those or if there's any discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And those items carry. That brings us back to the public hearing items, and item number 1 is a land use application appeal for 419 Washington Avenue North. We'll start with a brief presentation from staff. And then how many people would like to speak on item number 1? Okay, so then we'll open the public hearing after the staff presentation, and then I'll just note that item number 7 is related. Is that correct? Yes, item number 7 is related to this item, so we'll likely take up the 2 together.
Good morning, Chair Bender, council members. I will be brief this morning. This is an appeal by Zach Stofferon for the 419 Washington Avenue North project. This project was approved by the Planning Commission on the consent agenda at the April 20th, 2017 public hearing. You did see this item before in an appeal from the Heritage Preservation Commission. Former staff member Lisa Steiner was the planner at the time. I took over when she left the city. So the applications that were before the Planning Commission back in April were 3 conditional use permit for parking garage, a conditional use permit to increase the height of the building from the permitted 10 stories or 140 feet to 13 stories or 140 feet, and then site plan review. As I mentioned, all of those items were approved on consent without any discussion. The design that was before the Planning Commission did meet the conditions of approval that came out of the City Council action on the appeal for HPC, and that mostly had to do with the height of the building. This is the approved site plan. Nothing on the approved site plan had changed. The focus of the discussion really on the appeal, the previous appeal, was on the height. The height of the building has been reduced. It is the 13 stories, but within that 140-foot height limitation that was placed on them as a condition from that, and they do meet that. The appellant is appealing the decision of the Planning Commission, stating that he believes the city's zoning regulations and guidelines for the district are not being met. I will stand for any questions.
Okay, are there any questions for staff? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and open the public hearing and invite the appellant to come on up and speak. And just please state your name and address for the record.
Yep. I do have a presentation. Is there any way I could get this loaded up?
Staff can help with that.
Oops, sorry. And I do have handouts for you guys. Is this it? This isn't it.
I don't know why it's not working.
I know it may look daunting, but I promise to try to move swiftly. I know we've been through this before, so okay,
I don't know what's going on.
okay, that's okay.
I don't want to format your desk.
Okay.
So
But I did go through the 148-page report of the CPED staff, and I know we've been through a lot of these issues, but considering we're now kind of refacing this in a different way, I just thought I needed to address what they're trying to approve now in the conditional use permits. Sorry, no one else can see this, but if you then look on 2, obviously we're appealing the conditional use permit for the parking garage.
Do you have a copy of your presentation?
Yes.
We could put it on the
Okay. I'll do that.
overhead projector if you want.
Be hard to read, but okay. To increase the height of the building from the permitted 10 stories or 140 feet to 13 stories or 100 feet, and for the site plan for the new office building. My first question is, how did we end up in the same place? I don't blame the developers. Of course, they're going to do anything they can to avoid having to make changes to their plan. But I can't believe after you guys appealed this already in concept, CPED has rerouted us back to this exact same position, and we haven't even moved an inch. As I stand here and appeal this, it makes me wonder what the validity of me even doing this is when your comments and your previous ruling were completely disregarded. And more so, when I look at the CPC agenda, and at the bottom it says that all of their rulings are final and that only some measures go to the, as far as rezoning, go to the Zoning and Planning Commission. I find it kind of appalling that the only avenue the community has to take to draw attention to this is an appeal, does it make common, or is it to point out common sense that nothing has changed and that it takes $800 to come here and basically experience deja vu, and I feel like waste everyone's time. So what has changed with this building? I know Hillary said they reduced the height to 140. Oops, that is in the wrong, sorry. So where are we now? Actually, the building was reduced in height by 4 feet and mechanical by 10 feet. The mass is still grossly out of context and not 140 feet. The developers did not make site plan changes to fit the requirements by reducing stories and height to code. CPED and developers are again just attempting ways around the zoning requirements with variances and basically through semantics. CPED and developers believe if they simply get the building to 140 feet, it's acceptable. And that was basically reiterated in my conversations with them. And now, instead of reducing the stories to code for density issues, we're to believe that the stories will play no factor in the impact to its surroundings as they are trying to increase the stories. And parking was minimally reduced from 480 spaces to 408. It remains 8 stories, which is still extremely excessive for the area. It's detrimental to congestion, and it doesn't help alleviate the parking needs in the way the proponents believe it will. And I'll get into that more later. And I just wanted to point out, this was an opening discussion last time, and Mrs. Goodman, you said in relation to this whole parking thing was the public wanting it. You said build to what code allows. Don't look for any exception you can because they want parking, meaning us. So what really changed? Nothing. The building has not changed in concept. The height, mass, and parking extremes remain the same. They do not fit the requirements or solve any parking needs. The impacts to the neighborhood livability aren't changed and will only worsen by allowing buildings, these buildings to be at a scale. So as I said, I went kind of through these cups that they're looking for to increase the height of the building from the permitted 10 to 13 stories, and also to allow a principal parking garage. They both use the same requirements, so I kind of did a mashup to address the CPED staff report for both of them. The first requirement in finding is to the establishment, maintenance, and operation of the conditional use will not be detrimental to or endanger the public health, safety, comfort, or general welfare. In relation to the height, the CPED staff report says the proposal to increase the height from 10 to 13 stories but remain at 140 feet will not be detrimental to those factors. So basically, as long as it's 140 feet, those 3 stories don't matter. In regards to parking, they just say it will be below grade and the establishment of this principal parking garage will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, comfort, general welfare. So I guess because it's below grade, it won't be detrimental. So the entire argument that basically frames all this up is 140 is 140. You're not going to get an argument out of me that 140 feet is 140 feet. But 10 stories is not 13 stories. If you look at the conditional use permit, it says 10 stories or 140 feet, whichever is less. It's 10 or 140. Any amount within 140, but never more than 10 stories. So I simply ask, why is it meant to be capped at 10 stories and never more if it's not for density reasons? And why adding stories is an issue? We've been over this a lot, but CPED is arguing that any building of 140 feet is the same, regardless of its stories intended use, and has the same impact. So is 15 stories the same as 10? Is 18? If we made a 20-story building with 7-foot floor plates, would that work for a parking garage? I'd argue density is the major contributor to a neighborhood's public health, safety, comfort, and welfare. Together, as a principal parking garage and accessory parking, every additional story adds people and parking and incrementally impacts our comfort and general welfare with increased congestion. Scale and density are our only controlling factors. This will also start a new and dangerous precedent that any site plan anywhere would be approved as long as it's 140 feet. Why? Because if this is a 13-story building and it contains 8 stories of parking and it can be improved in a 5-story vicinity, what wouldn't be approved? And also, one thing that's never been answered is the developer could have plans to abandon the parking altogether for office space, making the parking issues worse. If it's solely for parking, why are they 10-foot floor plates and why can't they be 7 feet like other ramps? This has never been addressed that it will be guaranteed. The next requirement in finding is that adequate measures have been or will be taken to minimize traffic congestion in the public streets. In relation to height, CPED says increasing the height of the building will have no impact on traffic congestion. In relation to parking, they say they performed a travel demand management plan that concludes that overall the proposed development will have minimal impacts on intersection operations, that they all have the adequate capacity, and therefore the impact on existing operations is minimal. It also goes on to say there at the bottom that there's several transit options, there's a light rail, there's several metro bus routes, nice rides, all things that they're trying to say public transit will reduce this. So logically speaking, 8 of the 13 stories is parking. Increase in height to allow more stories directly correlates with more traffic. To say it has no impact is senseless. The parking garage more than doubles the amount of parking spaces and potential vehicle traffic. How is the 2-time increase minimal? The parking spaces will not cover the full building needs. We need to keep that in mind. The daily vehicle trips will far exceed the 408 parking spaces. And the public transit and bicycles won't significantly minimize traffic. What you introduce in the number of people and a lot of vehicles to an area is what you're going to get. And also another important factor is Washington Avenue has been reduced to 2 car lanes and 2 bike lanes, which just further complicates these issues. This is adding significantly to congestion. So as I go to try to reference this traffic demand management plan to figure out how they can justify this has no impact on traffic, the first thing I stumbled upon was in the preliminary development report, Donald Zart of the city, under traffic and parking says the nature of this proposed development is such that traffic impacts will be an issue. and he's who prompted them to do this. So I went and looked in the traffic demand management plan, and the goals of that are to determine the transportation implications of the proposed development and develop solutions to resolve any impacts, and to examine how it meets the city's goals to reduce automobile traffic and increase alternative transportation modes. At the bottom, importantly, it says the overall mode split goal is 40% single occupant vehicle, 40% transit, and 20% pedestrian bicycle. So, to see what they had to say about it, they first analyzed development traffic volumes. They used the Institute of Transportation Engineers to do this, the Trip Generation 9th edition. They also say that they did a literary search and had discussions with city staff, and then just reduced the gross trips by 35% based on these discussions with city staff. So if you look at Table 2, you can see the weekday trip generation. This simply highlights the AM and PM peak hours. I've highlighted there the existing use and the net total, but even if you look at the AM peak hour, the office you're showing there is 328 trips in, 77 for the restaurant. That's 405 right there. So the existing use has 794 weekday daily trips, and the new proposed net total is 2784. If you compare the two, that's a 250% increase. If you don't include the 35% reduction, it's 4,283 weekday daily trip, which is a 439% increase to the area. So I want to know how we came up with the 35% reduction. Basically says to me that more than 1 in 3 people are going to use public transit. It also doesn't meet the mode split goal that they laid out for it. And I'd like to know how this increase in trip generation is minimal impact. And also, the ITE Trip Generation 9th edition was released in 2012. So if they're not doing research on the intersections themselves, or maybe it's been updated since, but I think it's important to note if this isn't current, these impacts could be far worse than we're saying. So to come up with these numbers, they looked at every intersection and they compared against the 2020 no build, as if the building wasn't built, in 2020 build scenarios. You can just see they have those 3 numbers going in every which direction for it. The first one, I totaled these up. If you look at the AM peak hour on Washington Avenue, that's an extra 324 cars. It's a 12.2% increase. Fifth Avenue is 268 at a 40% increase. 3rd Street is 140 cars. 3rd Avenue is 54 cars. During the PM peak hour, it's 379 cars at a 14.4% increase. 5th Ave is 210 cars at 28% increase. 3rd Street, 69 cars. 3rd Avenue, 89 cars. I don't know if all of you ventured down to those one way, and to imagine this many more cars packed up on stoplights. Someone can tell me how that is a minimal impact. The other thing they do is they look at those intersection impacts from that, and they conclude in a capacity analysis comparing the existing 2020 and 2020 build scenarios. They measure this in level of service, grades from A to F. And level of service A, it represents the best intersection operation, and F represents the worst, with an operation of excessive delay. On Washington Ave and 3rd Avenue, the peak hours for both AM and PM is level of service D. Washington Avenue and 5th Avenue is also level of service D. And on 5th Avenue and 3rd Street, during the AM and PM peak hours, it's level of service C, all of which they say no improvements are necessary to accommodate the proposed use. And frankly, I wonder what can even be done. If you build it, that's what you get. So as I read that, the capacity analysis does not compare intersection impacts between the existing, the 2020 no build, or the 2020 build scenarios. It only broadly describes the intersections in terms of level of service. it says that the level of service is based on the time interval of each vehicle. So we need to know the time variances between A to C, D, or F to even know what those impacts are, nor does it even compare them. And if LSOD grades are acceptable, do only intersections of LOSF require improvements? And if the ITE data isn't current, as I said, is this far worse than D because of the growth that is happening constantly in the neighborhood? So they conclude with the overall traffic impacts. That's where we got this, that the proposed use has minimal impacts on intersection operations, that they have adequate capacity to accommodate the number of trips, and therefore impacts on existing operations are minimal. In my mind, the TDMP does nothing to prove the proposed use has minimal impacts on intersection operations. It simply states the data to represent the impacts without providing standards. And then it concludes in a brief analysis that operations are adequate. When I look at the increases in the daily trip, the peak hour vehicle intersection impacts, and the LOSD grades, that shows a large discrepancy to me in the current operation and the impact of the proposed use. So does common sense, as I said logically. We are adding a certain number of people and vehicles to it. It will impact. And basically, if I use the same data and concluded that the impacts are significant, what would make that not true? Beyond traffic, they also look at the parking impact to come up with how the amount of parking in the building is warranted. They also use the ITE data to do this, and they also adjust this 35% to account for the mode split site. They're saying during the peak weekday hours, that peak time period for parking demand is 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And they're saying that parking demand during that time is 550 spaces. Also down at the bottom under parking operation, it says that, just to note how it's going to be used, 208 of them will be available to the general public on an hourly basis, 24 hours a day. So the numbers they got to arrive at that conclusion, you can see where I highlighted up above, the 550 peak parking that was adjusted by 35%. It shows that the restaurant is going to require 112 parking spots, and the office building parking demand needs is 438. That's where they get the total 550. If you don't adjust it, the gross total parking is 846. And in my mind, there's no way to definitively say that won't be the demand or close at peak times, or find some middle ground in between, but we can't guarantee it's 550. Also, the 208 spots will not serve neighboring businesses, residents, or other, as proponents believe. The site plan alone, as you can see, could cannibalize the parking while introducing more spillover and furthering congestion and parking issues, leaving us in the same or worse position. We are only netting an extra 105 spots from the surface lot. The surface lot has 103 spots. That additional 105 spots is already evaporated by the restaurant alone. This building and the site plan is going to create more parking headaches than people believe by having this additional public parking. We don't look at this beyond face value. We just look at it and say, here's an extra 200 spots. So that must be a good thing. And we don't look at it beyond that.
I'm noting that we're only about halfway through. And
Sorry.
while I appreciate the detail, I
Yes.
think if you could maybe focus on the high-level points, we do have
Yeah.
the presentation
Of
so that we
course.
can
Of course.
have the detail here. Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so to skip through to the conclusion of the traffic demand management plan. Did it determine the transportation implications? Mostly. Did it develop solutions to resolve these impacts? No. Did it meet the city's goals to reduce automobile traffic? No. Did it implement ways to increase alternative transportation modes? Maybe. They do promote ways to use public transit. I guess I just asked, do you agree this has no impact on traffic congestion? And does this site plan take measures to minimize traffic congestion? And how does this site plan help parking issues? The next big issue I just want to go over is the scale. Land use policy 1.2.1 says that it needs to be in scaled massing in the setbacks of the context of the surrounding area. CPED in regards to this say the site is located in District B and that structures in this can include 2 to 10 stories, and this is generally consistent. We've already heard those arguments. In the last appeal, there's no buildings of 10 stories. The height of the surrounding buildings is 1 to 6 stories. This is a quick first massing concept I want to point out from them. This is provided in DJR. The first one is a base height they show in point 1. You can see the line going across western container. The base height of the building alone is the same height as the surrounding buildings. The middle and top exceed it. Number 2, I just want to point out, they say the skyway is connecting a historical connection, and it is not. And then 3, just quickly, they have step back and roof amenity to allow for downtown views. And I think part of this is just to get a building tall enough so that they can sell these premium office spaces with downtown views. The second one, to give it a good comparison, this is 419 Wash Ave on the next page. It's 13 stories. It's 419,000 square feet. And Western Container next to it is 6 stories, 85 feet, and only 55,000 square feet. My point is, and I point this out, but do a simple game of building Tetris around this. And you could fit all 4 of those buildings inside of this building. We only focus on the height, but the mass is just as much of a big of a deal for the amount of people and vehicles they can fit in that. The next ones are just simply factors. They talk about access to light and air will not be affected. They say that won't be because public streets, an alley and a roadway trench separate it. I don't understand how that's an argument. If you build a building of that mass, just because there's streets separating it doesn't mean it can't diminish light and air. The next one is, I only want to point out it's about scale and character, but CPED's own report right here says it's 1 in 6 stories. And while it will be taller than the existing surrounding buildings, there are other buildings of similar height. Doesn't matter if there's other buildings of similar height. There's not, first of all, but this says surrounding, and it's 1 in 6. So a couple things in the site plan review. We've been over that, but just to point out things that are requiring other variances. The windows on 3rd Street, it requires 30% minimum, and it's only 14. They say it meets historical preservations just because it approved a certificate of appropriateness, and that's just not true. We've already appealed one based on that decision. The Skyway connection is not allowed under HPG, Heritage Preservation Guidelines, because it used to connect the Haywood building and self-storage. And it also says to consider the scale of the surrounding buildings, of which we've been over. The next point is it says under the urban design policy to locate buildings so that shadowing on public spaces and adjacent properties is minimized. And this building height creates significant shadowing on adjacent properties, as you can see in the figures there. The last thing I want to point out, I almost hate to do it because I don't find 140 feet to be relevant to the surrounding vicinity, but as I look through this, they're only measuring the building on 3rd Street. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but they're adding an additional story by measuring on that corner. The only corner of the building that gets under 140 feet is there on 3rd Street. Another rendering that shows that. You can see between where they're measuring on 3rd on the right and then where the entry is on 5th Ave on the left, they're getting that whole additional parking floor in there by doing so. And my last point, you can see it here too, at the bottom. It's just floating up in midair above the parking entrance, and the roof amenity floor is well above 140 feet. I know rooftop mechanics can be above the 140 feet as long as they are placed 1 foot back for every 10 feet. But in the last appeal, Mrs. Goodman said that nothing should ever be over 140 feet, including mechanics at the lowest grade. Whether that applies or not, I don't see this as mechanical. They have a floor plan for it. It's a roof amenity and in a closed space. So to summarize here, the site plan does not meet zoning requirements. The findings for these conditional use permits provide subjective and broad analysis. They're often misleading or falsely representing the data because they can't be rationalized. Simply, they should be adhering to all these requirements, not trying to find ways around them. The developers in CPED treat these factors and guidelines as if they're irrelevant or can be disregarded. Why are they written if they're not intended to be followed? They should be required in all circumstances unless unavoidable, and this is not one of those cases. This does not assist the neighborhood parking in the manner people believe it will. They're taking advantage of the need to use it as an asset to get this approved, and this will just create more parking headaches and congestion than it can negate. Plus, they could write that minor change and convert it to office space. The original plan they proposed was a 10-story office space building with 3 below-grade parking levels. Sounds pretty familiar if they got rid of it. And frankly, no logical person could ever say this size of this building is in historic context of the surrounding, and it's what these regulations and guidelines intended. Proof is in that Haywood manufacturing building that used to sit in that spot that is only 4 stories high. This is the largest proposed building in stories and mass. It's the most out of proportion to its surroundings building context in the neighborhood. There have been many developments in recent years, and not one of them is out of proportion to its surroundings. They're requiring variances and conditional use permits to rewrite these rules and precedents. And once this domino falls, there's no turning back. Keeping in scale is the only thing we have to control the issues from rapid growth in this neighborhood. The traffic, the livability, the comfort, the general welfare, these exact things we're trying to protect with these rules are already being impacted when we're keeping in scale, and it will only get worse. This is 2 buildings in one. It's an 8-story parking garage and a 5-story office building. Each of them alone are larger in mass than the surrounding vicinity. And I just question, would we even approve an 8-story parking garage in that site plan? You just break it up and look at it. We need to choose if they want office space or parking and abide by the Minneapolis rules and regulations. So as Mrs. Goodman said last time, we may want parking, they may want an office space, but choose one. You don't get to do whatever you want. They just see this neighborhood as an 8 to 5 cash cow, and they have no care how it impacts the neighborhood or the people in it. We need someone to be able to mandate simply that they follow the rules, or we could quickly become a business district. And I just want to highlight a few of these proposed buildings. You can see at the top, this is a new one. It's 13 stories. It's 419,000 square feet. It's by far the largest. If you go down to the United Properties one down at 729 Washington, it's one of the ones that have received some of the most pushback too. And we asked them in the meetings, that's going to have 1,000 employees and another 400 parking spots. My biggest concern is no one is looking at the neighborhood as a whole. We look at each one of these in a vacuum and improve it without looking at the impact to the entire neighborhood. So we've been here, we've done this. How do we reach a conclusion and avoid this from happening again? We have been to countless neighborhood meetings. We've been to HPC. We've been here, we've appealed this once. We've been through this again. All of our arguments, all of us simply stating that these rules and regulations are not being met have been avoided. We've been disregarded. We may have been left high and dry, but that doesn't mean we're wrong. That doesn't mean we should stop fighting. We are not the ones standing here asking for your sympathy or saying that the rules and regulations are not fair to us as residents. We're not arbitrarily trying to interpret what a guideline says and shift it to our narrative. All we're doing is simply saying, here's the rules you set out, follow them. It should be basic common sense. I shouldn't have to be here today to do the baseline of the job. So as they're not willing to move on their position, I can tell you there's people like me lined up out the door to come back here as many times as it takes. Because in our mind, we're not wrong. There's nothing we're saying other than do as you set out to do, the city, and what you say needs to be done. So we'll be here as long as we take. We all want to see the building go up. We all like it. It would be great to add a new retail restaurant. It'd be great to have a few levels of office or parking, but decide what the neighborhood needs. It doesn't mean we should allow something so grossly out of context and start new precedents when the neighborhood is 95% developed. Now is not the time to start that. So please, if some of you think we are wrong, enlighten me. Otherwise, I guarantee you we'll plan to be back as many times as they want to try to do this.
Okay, thank you
very much.
Would anyone else like to speak on this item? Okay, come on up. So since we've had such an extensive presentation, ask to keep to about 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, I realized
please
Zach made
state
a lot
your
of good points. Oh, so my name is Matt
name.
Galland, Fifth Avenue Lofts, 401 North 2nd Street. Yeah, I was going to make some points that Zach said, so I don't need to take all the time, but definitely agree with a lot of his comments. I mean, the main question is, why should this building get preferential treatment? And, I have not heard any reasons why it should. And I definitely sympathize with the developer trying to just get the most ROI from the project. It's really the government's job. You all fulfilled that role. And the last time, HBC and CPC seems to be breaking its own rules, a bit biased in how things are presented. I agree with Zach and a lot of the points he raised. It's very clear what the rules say, the intention of the rules. Councilman Goodman did point out why it's 10 stories or 140 feet the last time it was appealed, to give room for the rooftop equipment, I believe it was, and she can correct me if that's wrong. So it's very clear. It's not like the rules are arbitrary, like, 13 stories and 140 feet are the same as 10 stories and 140 feet. It's not including that rooftop equipment and the like. It is frustrating to have the rules written down that are made by consensus. Why are there, 8 unelected commissioners breaking it multiple times? Why have the rules at all if that's okay? There's not extenuating circumstances here. I've not heard any extenuating circumstances. The rules were built exactly for the reason for this building. I don't see why there should be exceptions. A lot of the other points I have, Zach had raised. The big question is, if this building is allowed, why wouldn't a lot of other 13-story buildings be let? And if we don't want that to happen, why should this building be the one that gets preferential treatment? As an example, I live in Fifth Avenue Lofts. It's a 6-story building, 5 or 6, depending on grade. 3 to 4 floors are underground. One suggestion is just bring more of these floors underground instead of building them above ground. There's only a couple stories. 50% of my building is underground, and this building is twice as tall, more than twice as tall. So that's certainly one suggestion. Just generally, if you just believe in, government kind of applying equality and fairness to all the buildings, all the developers, prioritizing voters, I would expect you to approve the appeal. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak on this item? Maybe the project team? Come on up. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you. Ms. Lansing, can you speak specifically to whether or not there's anything over 140 feet? And if so, what is it? And how you view that as complying with the max 140 feet?
Yes, good morning, committee members, Councilmember Goodman. There are mechanical units above the 140-foot level, but those do not count by the rules, how the rules are applied. You do not include the height of the mechanical units on the roof or the stair and elevator overruns, depending on their placement and their overall height. So long as they are less than 14 feet above roof level and set back from the roof edge a certain amount, they don't count in the height, in the 140-foot height limit. That's the rule, and that's part of the revisions that were made, so this project does meet the 140-foot height limit.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Lansing, can you see the elevator overrun and the staircase from the street?
Well, that's the purpose of having a certain amount of setback, and it is a tall building. So, if you're far enough back away from the building, if you're a couple blocks away, you can probably see them. If you're at street level, you wouldn't be able to.
Are there any other buildings in the area that are historic that you can show me that would have 13-foot tall stairwell overruns or elevator overruns?
I don't know what's on the roof. Well, there are things on the roof of the Ford building. This building is shorter than the Ford building, which is a 10-story building. I don't know everything on the roof. I think some of it is. I don't know if Dean knows. And other historic buildings that have decks or mechanical units on.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Did you have anything else you wanted to present?
Well, I wanted to point out that the neighborhood has approved this project 3 times, the neighborhood organization, and people are invited to attend those meetings. They specifically like the public parking, which is below grade, and this project would be 10 stories, except that it added public parking and needed to then find a way to also accommodate accessory parking at the bequest of the neighborhood organization. I will point out there is no minimum parking requirement here, but there is need and demand for it. So the arguments and concerns about traffic impacts and parking impacts are being mitigated by including parking in this building. The traffic TDMP is a standard requirement. It was not unusual for this building, and it concluded that the streets have capacity to accommodate the traffic that it'll generate. This project is what the B4N district is intended to do, which is to promote density in the neighborhood surrounding downtown. There's no FAR limit. The size of the building is not exceeding any size limits. The height of the building in the B4N is 10 stories or 140 feet, whichever is less. But in this case, it appears like a 10-story building. It's the same height it could be if it were 10 stories and 13. It's technically 13 because of the additional parking levels. But you would have to find, in order to deny this CUP, that because it's technically a 13-story building, it has some adverse impacts that a 10-story building of the same height would not have. And there's no facts or rationale to support that. The immediately surrounding buildings are 1 to 6. But there are 10-story buildings in the area, and 10-story buildings are allowed by the code. Since you saw this last, the height was reduced to meet the rules, and the parking levels that are above grade were aligned. Those were both concerns that were discussed when the first project came forward to you on appeal from the HPC. Since then, the HPC approved this project against the Historic District guidelines, and there was no appeal of that decision. The Planning Commission unanimously approved the project on the consent agenda. No one from the neighborhood organization or otherwise from the neighborhood came to object. We were not planning to do a design presentation, but Mr. DeVolis is here in case you have any further questions about the design.
Okay,
And I'll end unless you
thank you.
have questions for me.
Are there any further questions for the applicant? Councilman, no? Okay, there are none. Would anyone else like to speak?
Thank you.
Anyone else? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. So we have 2 items on this application, 3 items as an appeal for the conditional use permit for the parking garage, conditional use permit for the height, and a site plan review appeal as well. Is there any motion on this item? And we've been joined by Councilmember Fry, who represents this part of the city. Councilmember Goodman.
I'm going to move to deny the appeal. I hate to have to do this because I don't like this at all, and I'm very sympathetic to the applicants, but here's how I view it. 140 feet is 140 feet, no matter how they make it up within the building. I've had this issue in my ward as well, and I have it right now on West Lake Street, and I believe that they can put 10-foot ceilings in, they could put 12-foot ceilings in, they could have 16 on some floors and 10 on others, but the way the neighborhood views it is as 140 feet. And what we're looking at here is a conditional use permit, which is a really easy thing to get. I want to be clear, conditional use permit means allowed with conditions. And it seems to me as though they met the conditions. As much as I don't like it, I do think they've met the conditions. And so I could be a brat and vote against it, decide with the neighbors to be popular, but I just don't think that's the right thing to do here. As much as I would prefer it was a smaller building and completely agree. There's nothing in the area that's 10 stories, and I would not want to start a precedent myself. I believe they've met the conditions for the conditional use permit, and that's really how we have to judge it, I think, legally. I do take issue with Ms. Lansing's assertion, however, that just because they didn't appeal the HPC's decision or they didn't show up on time, if they did show up and you don't know they did or didn't at the Planning Commission, that no one objects. The applicants are entitled to their day in court, and they took today to do it, and I think it's our job to listen to them, and I feel like we did. But I don't see how in the end they don't meet the criteria for a conditional use permit. If this was a variance on height, or if there was a bigger issue in front of us, that might give us some more leeway, but I just don't see it here. So as much as I don't like it, I believe legally it's the correct thing to do. And for that reason, I would support it and move to deny the appeal.
Okay, thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion to deny the appeal for the 3 items? I'll just note that I do appreciate the design care that has been taken to mask the parking. It would not be my personal preference to put in so much parking, to be frank, but I will note that we have a building in my ward that has something like 7 stories of parking, and it was before my time on the council. And again, I may have pushed back on that, but that parking is used by buildings all throughout the area and has allowed a lot of flexibility in the design of other buildings that are on sites that may not have been able to be developed if they weren't able to use the parking in the building there, which has so much extra. So I think when we're building out these kind of parts of town, again, where we do have relatively permissive zoning because the city has identified this as an area for growth and new development, to maintain that flexibility, I think does add some value. So, all right, then any discussion on item number 1? Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And then I will also go ahead and move item 7, which is the alley vacation for this project as well. Any discussion on that? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That item carries. And that brings us to item number 2, which is a conditional use permit and variance appeal for a project on Marshall Street Northeast. We'll begin again with the staff presentation. How many people would like to speak on this item? Okay, great, thank you. So again, we'll just have the staff presentation and a chance for questions from council members, and then we'll open the public hearing and hear from folks about the project. With setting up, I'll just note that item number 8 is also relevant to this project, so we'll take that one up after this hearing.
Okay, good morning, Chair Bender, committee members. My name is Peter Crandall. I'm a senior planner with CPAD. The appeal before you today is regarding a development proposal at 14th Avenue Northeast and Marshall Street Northeast. The appeal was filed by Joyce Smallfield on behalf of the Sheridan Neighborhood Organization regarding an approval that was made by the City Planning Commission on April 10th of this year to approve several land use applications for this development project. The original application included a conditional use permit to increase the maximum building height, a variance to reduce the minimum parking requirement, a variance to reduce the minimum loading requirement, a variance to reduce the rear yard setback, site plan review, and preliminary and final plat. In addition to those applications, we are considering a rezoning application today from the C1 Neighborhood Commercial District to the C3A Community Activity Center District.
The applicant, in response to concerns raised by the neighborhood, has made some changes to the development proposal, which has resulted in their withdrawing 2 of the original applications, which I will go over shortly. First, to the question of the rezoning. This is a zoning map of the site as it stands today. There are 4 parcels on the proposed development site, all currently zoned for the C1 Neighborhood Commercial District. The applicant is seeking, again, the C3A Community Activity Center District. This site is located within the Grain Belt Activity Center, an adopted activity center through the Minneapolis Comprehensive Plan. Policy guidance in the comprehensive plan about activity centers guides them for a mix of uses with citywide and regional draw, including a high intensity of uses, employment, commercial, office, and residential uses, high density and very high density development dependent on context. This is a map showing where activity centers are located throughout the city. You'll see that the grain belt is circled at the top there. Generally, activity centers are guided to intersect with some of the more important corridors in the city. Those include adopted commercial corridors and community corridors. The Grain Belt Activity Center is at or near the intersection of 4 community corridors, including Marshall Street Northeast and Broadway Northeast, and then across the river directly from the West Broadway Commercial Corridor. So that formed the basis for the designation of this area as an activity center in the comprehensive plan. This is the site as it stands today, largely vacant, partially used for parking for the Dusty's bar. And then the proposed site plan for the project. I'll note that this plan is not changing as a part of the proposed changes that the applicant is bringing forward today. You'll see that the parking is all accommodated within an enclosed parking structure at grade. Along Marshall Street Northeast, the building is lined with active uses, including 2 live-work units and amenity space for the project. This is to comply with our site plan review requirements that buildings be lined with active uses at the street front. The building is also set back, you'll notice, at the 14th Avenue Northeast elevation to comply with the yard requirements for the adjacent residential properties. So just to address the changes that are being proposed today by the applicant, they are reducing the height at the rear of the structure. So this is along the alley on the 14th Avenue elevation. This removes a number of units and serves to transition the building somewhat more towards the residential property at the back. It also eliminates the requirement for a variance to the parking requirement and to the loading requirement. The project is qualifying for our 50% reduction in minimum parking requirements because of its proximity to high-frequency transit. Additionally, because the unit count has dropped below 100, they no longer require a loading space per the zoning code. So the remaining applications then are the rezoning from C1 to C3A, conditional use permit to increase the maximum building height, variance of the rear yard, site plan review, and preliminary and final plat. There's also a variance to the subdivision standards within that. I will note that there was a question raised at City Planning Commission and subsequently about when this site received its current zoning designation, and question about whether there had been a recent rezoning. We can find no record of recent rezoning on the parcel going back to 1999, which would have been the most recent citywide rezoning to comply with comprehensive plan adoption. So I will conclude there and take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for staff? Okay, there aren't any. So why don't we go ahead and open the public hearing? I think we'll start with the folks who've appealed the project and then let the applicant speak at the end. Does that sound fine? Okay. So let's go ahead and open the public hearing. We don't have the timer today, but Ms. Wallace from my office has happily agreed to be our timekeeper. So we'll give you a little extra time, but then each person after will be 2 minutes speaking each.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chair Bender and committee members. My name is Jenny Portman, and I live at 1515 Grand Street in Sheridan neighborhood. And I am speaking on behalf of Sheridan Neighborhood Organization, the city recognized representative for Sheridan neighborhood, as well as the co-appellants who are the 13th Avenue Business Association, Kieran Folliard, the food building, separate all of the businesses within the food building, and multiple other adjacent businesses and residents who wish to be signed on as appellants. You can find that list at the back of the appeal. So we are here because we actually oppose the rezoning as well as all of the variance and the conditional use. I'm confused by the fact that you can't find any rezoning of this parcel recently, because we worked with the current owner. It couldn't have been more than 5 years ago to help allow music in Dusty's bar, and it required a rezoning, which we had to actually push our council person at the time to do. So it was originally zoned R1, I believe, and all the parcels had to be rezoned to C1 in order to allow the entertainment at Dusty's. So I don't understand how it wasn't found. There was a lot of discussion at the time. It was around the same time as our small area planning was happening. And so the community did discuss the C1 designation for that site and agreed that it was appropriate for the vision we have there. I guess I should start with the fact that Sheridan Neighborhood Organization and the community have a long track record of working with developers and encouraging developing the community, commercial and residential, multi-unit rental home ownership, and we encourage a lot of reuse of existing buildings. Our vision for the future is to try and maintain the character and the affordability of our community. One strategy being to reuse existing buildings, which of course come with limitations. And in recognition of that, we often have to, allow variances for those buildings in order that they can be reused. So in this case, when you look at the building being a blank slate, the lot being essentially a vacant lot and a blank slate, it's hard to, we disagree with staff assessment that there's some kind of unique circumstance here that should require any rezoning or variance or conditional use for that matter. So starting with the rezoning, it was a discussion within the last 5 years that be a C1. Furthermore, it's been brought to our attention that the plan that the developer has is could be made with the current zoning. So it's not we don't understand even the purpose of wanting to rezone it out at all. Our small area plan considers this area appropriate for mixed use, so commercial and residential mixed together. The developer is proposing a single use. It basically conflicts with the policies and the intent and spirit of the small area plan, which envisions this mixed use and 14th Avenue remaining a more calm street. Our plan actually shows 14th Avenue being the place where you can come off of the Mississippi River bike system and have a calm avenue into the neighborhood, as opposed to taking 13th, which is more congested and is much more active. So adding extensive density there is not in the interest of the neighborhood. We're looking for more of a medium density. The square block itself has 10 homes and 4 businesses. The 10 homes are mostly duplex. So right now, with the proposal that the developer has for this site, and you may or may not know, they're proposing an almost identical building for the other corner of the same block. They would be increasing the density of this block by tenfold. So we're looking for a C1 zoning, a building that is more within a 3 to 4 story, more like a 30 units with commercial use. The impact of the parking for this much density is detrimental to the area. The small business across the street, which did reuse an old building and houses 4 or 5 different businesses and over 30 employees, would be hurt by this. Some of the building has there is no associated parking, and the restaurant, the Draft Horse, would be directly in front of where they're proposing to put their parking entrance. So there's no parking for the restaurant, plus the entry for parking lot is right in front of the building. The height also affects the Draft Horse and the food building, in that the food building has solar panels on the roof, and the patio for the Draft Horse would be actually shaded, and is, it's well used and liked for its sunny spot. Moving on to well, let's see, we covered the height. The parking variance, I know that they are actually now have figured out that they can just simply reduce the number of buildings. I mean, this is part of our point. They're creating their own hardship on this site. I mean, to require 4 variances in a conditional use on, they can just design a building that would actually fit there, and that's actually going to not have such an intensive impact on the community surrounding it. So we feel that the 1 car per unit is a more appropriate requirement for parking. We've learned from working with the Greenbelt area apartments, they did do 1 site per unit, but they intended to use half of it for visitors. They've now had to convert it all to resident parking because of the demand. And there are still extra cars on the street. These people do use transit, which means their cars are left on the street during the day, and when RSP Architects employees come, they have nowhere to park because they have inadequate parking as well. In fact, when we did our small area planning 5 years ago, this was a major concern of the businesses along 13th Avenue, that parking was already an issue, and that was before we had this 200-unit apartment complex. So furthermore, the transit is over 4 blocks away and is about to be cut 40%. So it's difficult to think that, we can rely on that. We know that the developer has other pro forma that can work at this site. They're using their most intensive, you can see all over town, CPM has 6-story buildings with almost exactly this model. And obviously it works for them. But we know from the fact that they need so much variance to get their building on this site that it's really too intensive. They have other pro forma. They are building 3- and 4-story buildings in other parts of the city, and that would be much more appropriate to the site. We're not against working with them. We're not trying to kill the development. We are trying to just get something that's more appropriate to the site. There's a movement northeast, people concerned about uptowning our northeast, and this feels kind of like the first domino to fall, where all of a sudden there's a different feel to our community. There's nothing wrong with uptown, but northeast wants to be northeast. The loading requirement, even if they don't require it for under 100 units, it still pushes the moving in and out into the public right-of-way. 14th is a pretty narrow street, and then they're also asking to reduce the setback on the alley, which is, the alley itself is 3 feet narrower than a normal alley. So again, this is a condition that may, that should be considered regardless of what the letter of the law reads. And the traffic impact management plan states that the nature of this proposed development is such that traffic impact will be an issue for this site. Again, 14th is narrow, the alley is narrow, that part of Marshall Street actually narrows due to the historic buildings, and so there's difficulty in safely navigating the turns and that kind of thing. We also have 2 snow emergency routes at 13th Avenue and at Marshall Street, and then we also have a fire department 3 blocks away. So maintaining clear and free streets is critically important. So, you know, the proposed variances are not to be given, you know, and they're not meant to injure the safety of public safety and health. And we feel that some of these do. So I guess in conclusion, while the Shared Neighborhood Organization and our co-appellants support development in the neighborhood, and we look forward to people who are interested in investing in our community, we also expect that they contribute to the community rather than detract. We expect that they mitigate as much of the impact that they're going to have on their own site so that we can have the opportunity to maintain more affordable business and homes by using existing buildings. And we look forward to working with the developer to try and create a building that's appropriate for the site.
Thank you.
Yep.
Would anyone else like to speak? Please come on up and state your name and address.
Hello, I'm Karen, and I own a building at 1509 Marshall Street. And I think what I want to talk about is a few things quickly. One is I'm a lay person, and I've read through some of the city documents. And one of the things that strikes me is that the planning and zoning has a responsibility to have orderly development. And I would like to make a case that this particular project with the number of variances and CPUs and rezoning isn't exactly orderly development. It is located in an activity center, which I understand is an important aspect, but I have a map of the East Sector activity centers. And I don't know, can this thing work? So I know you're all familiar with it, but when I go out and look at these other activity centers, I see commercial, and it's a center where people come to do neighborhood business, and it's not just a large residential area. It specifically says activity centers are for a mix of uses, and commercial is one of the uses that all other activity centers have. So I have in my head, this isn't orderly because it's residential, it's a single use in an activity center. And that doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't make sense that it's orderly development. It seems disorderly development. The other point is that I think that the developer is asking for a more intensive commercial zoning specifically just for his own pocketbook, as you will, because the use that he's proposing exists in a C1 zoning district. He's not proposing anything that needs a C3A zoning. He can build residential on this vacant lot. The other issue is that it is a vacant lot. He can ask for many variances and claim that the proposal I want to build doesn't fit on this lot. But I would ask you to say, make your development fit on this lot. It doesn't work the other way around unless you're just giving him, you know, a monetary advance. So more intensive zoning is a monetary advance. No other C3A zoning exists anywhere on plot number 9, which is the northeast sector. None. C1 exists in many locations. That is consistent and orderly development. C3A doesn't exist anywhere else.
We'd ask that you
What?
Make your final statements, please, and then we'll.
Can I
move to the next
finish?
person. Yep.
So the other issue I have with the orderly development is that you wisely ask for these kind of developments to fit within the neighborhood. I understand that the Planning Commission does not require a schematic drawing that needs to be in scale. And in fact, the developer has provided a schematic drawing of his proposal in the neighborhood, but it is not drawn to scale, which means he can make his building look much smaller than it is. So because I'm an artist, I understand some things about perspective. So the blue lines are one perspective, drawn in scale. And as you can see, it follows the Dusty's, the smaller building that's 2 stories. It has a roof line and then a vanishing point, which meets at the blue asterisk. The developer's building has a different scale. As you can see, it meets in some space in the pink or red asterisk, which means the 2 buildings are drawn in different scales. Now, he's not required to show you it in scale. That's not one of the requirements for the Planning Commission papers. But this stuff used to be called shenanigans. And now it's called alternative facts. But how are we to judge if this building fits within the scale of the neighborhood if it's drawn out of scale? I stacked, in my next picture, I stacked 3 Dusty's buildings, which would be 6 stories tall, which is his building, is a 6-story tall building. And as you can see, his building essentially is a 4-story tall building. Now, this is what the shenanigans do. It looks like it fits in the neighborhood in his building, but in fact it doesn't. I don't know how you trust a developer who does alternative facts or shenanigans. Where else does he cut the corners? I know this person has had a difficulty with some developments with water being pumped into lagoons in Uptown. And this is another example of why some neighborhoods don't trust some developers. The last thing is, I understand variances are something, at least I think they're a tool to allow excellent development if they need to be used. Specifically, they are tools if there is a constraint on a property, a pre-existing building, something very odd, then yes, apply for a variance and demand that that development excels in all aspects. I think this development is one that is going to cause problems for the neighborhood that we will be dealing with for years later. Specifically, I understand the loading zone has been not required anymore because there are less than 100 spaces, but there is still a variance for the alley setback, which he's asking it to be reduced by 1/3 in an already small alley. So 1/3 is a large variance. If you asked him to say, no, we need that setback, again, there would be fewer units, and from my perspective, less problems down the road for the neighborhood in terms of parking. So you have the tools to help make this a better development for the neighborhood, the zoning and all the variances, and we just ask you to use those tools wisely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next person, please come up. Thanks.
Joy Smallfield, 1414 6th Street Northeast. And I just want to speak a little bit about whether or not our small area plan is even considered when we're talking about development, and the work that the neighborhoods do in order, the extensive work the neighborhoods do in order to present a plan to the city that says, this is where we see different uses, what we want our neighborhood to look like, and with the direction of which we want development to happen within our neighborhood. The conditional use permit and the variances all benefit the developer only. There are going to create hardships on the small businesses and the artists that we are trying to promote within our neighborhood. We have a strong working class, artist, small business group of people who live in the neighborhood, and this kind of development is only benefiting them. There's another point that they say there's because of the proximity to the mass transit, that they have a reduction in the parking. But actually, there is one bus line that runs, I think, 3 blocks away from this development, which I wouldn't consider intensive mass transit. And like Jenny said, the Green Belt had 1 spot per unit and has had to extend their visitor parking to the residents that live there. And I think the others have touched on the point, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Come on up, please. Thanks.
Ted Abramson, 1427 Marshall Street Northeast. I'm an owner of multiple small apartment buildings in the neighborhood, and I see this development as a positive for the neighborhood in its current state, and I think they've made some moves to bring the unit count down, which I don't necessarily agree with, because I think more units are needed in that neighborhood. So I support some of the variances that they have in their development and think that it's an aspect of the neighborhood that needs to continue growing further down into the core of Northeast.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak?
Tim Kennedy, and I live at 1121 3rd Street. There's a couple things. The parking reduction, I believe you wrote the variance for, or the ordinance for that, right, Ms. Bender? And
Stand behind that.
I don't understand how they're within a quarter mile of it, but one of my neighbors was saying they are. But so I don't think they meet that requirement. They're also in the new green zone that the city passed. So to stop gentrification, which is exactly what this is, because $1,000 for a 500 square foot apartment is not affordable housing. It's just not. So.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Okay, we'll turn to the applicant. Welcome.
Hi, my name's Pasquale Stevie, and I own Dusty's Bar and the property we're discussing right now. We've been there 66 years, and over the last 3 years of basically interviewing developers, a lot of them would just as soon tear down the bar, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted to keep the bar. I thought it was important for me, important for the community, and important for my employees to have a job. So, and looking to retirement, I wanted to retire but not retire. And I found somebody with Dan here that would run the bar, hire my staff, and keep me working. And that was very important to me and the community, I thought. So, which is still is. Anyway, see, that's it.
Thank you, sir. Would anyone else like to speak? The applicant perhaps could answer some of the questions that have come up.
Hello again, committee members. Carol Lansing, Faegre Baker Daniels, representing the development team. I did want to go through the plan revisions with you to explain a bit more on how they mitigate the height of the building. So for this wing of the building, the 6th floor has been removed. That's a 73-foot depth of that is now only 5 stories adjacent to this R4 neighborhood. This, while it's currently, this half of the block is occupied with 1, 2, 3 unit buildings, it is zoned R4. It is intended for medium density, and it has a height limit of 4 stories, 56 feet. The height of the building now, with the revision on the alley side, is 54 feet 10 inches. So it is consistent in height now next to the R4 district with what would be allowed in the R4 district. the floor area was increased here. This is what the original plan was. There was some increase in floor area here where it's interior to the site, not close to the neighborhood, to help make up for some of that lost floor area. And although not a change from the previous plan, I did want to point out as another mitigation of height that this part of the building, this wing, is set back from the street 10.5 feet. So that also helps transition this building both into the neighborhood and across from the food building. The number of the units was reduced from 110 to 95, so that no parking variances required and no loading variances required. Other factors that mitigate the impact of the building on the street in the neighborhood. This is along Marshall. This is not a change, but the building facade along Marshall is set back 5.5 to 6.5 feet from the property line. There is lots of articulation, windows, balconies, multiple street entrances that all enliven what's now a vacant lot, enliven the street, add engagement with the public street. The context of the area, this will be a taller building in the area, but it will be shorter than the grain belt, and it is consistent with the goals of activity centers. We submitted a shadow study to you, a new one that was done since we heard about concerns of shadowing on the Draft Horse patio. This is the Draft Horse patio, and between April and September, mid-April, mid-September, there will be no shadows from this building on that patio when it's being used for outdoor dining. And the shadows from the building will never reach the solar panels on the food building. Those solar panels are further north, away from, not even in this picture. The setback from the alley, here there's be 20 feet between the building. We are asking for a setback variance on only one, and on that side along the alley. Reduce or increasing the setback wouldn't just mean a loss of units, it would also mean either a loss of parking or a loss of active uses along the streets, because it would compress the floor area where we currently have parking. Regarding parking and traffic impacts, we don't need a variance now, but a travel demand management plan was performed, or a traffic study was all that Public Works required, and it showed that there'll be no significant impacts on the roadways and no roadway mitigation is required. Since the Planning Commission hearing, we also asked SPAC Consulting to do a parking study of on-street parking to show, and it showed that within a 2-block area, there's about 280, 290 on-street parking spaces, and at any time during the study, which was done throughout the day on a Thursday and a Saturday, there were over 100 of those parking spaces unused. Regarding the small area plan and zoning of this site, the site has been zoned C1 for quite a while. I think what they might be referring to, a few years ago, Dusty's needed a non-conforming use certificate to prove up that it had grandfather rights to be a nightclub. It needed those in order to get a license that would allow the music or for them to continue to do the music that they were doing. It's non-conforming in a C1 district as a nightclub. It will be conforming in a C3 district, but it wasn't a rezoning application that was brought to the city. The small area plan does not have any specific guidance for C1 district or height in it. The only guidance that applies to this site, or the most direct, is that it acknowledges it's in an activity center. And it repeats the guidance from the comprehensive plan about activity centers, that they are to promote high density and mixed use. These parcels were not added to the activity center for the benefit of the developer. Activity centers and C3A zoning are like the perfect fit. The C3A zoning title is Community Activity Center District. They're intended to promote high density and a mix of uses, not a mix necessarily in every building, but in the area. And the purpose of having this around the grain belt complex is to support the uses and the historic reuse of those buildings, both commercial uses and others. It's to promote more commercial uses, but also to promote a lot of residents coming to this area to support those businesses and the other businesses around the activity center, like the food building and the artists and the other organizations in the neighborhood. So bringing these residents will be a good thing. Won't just redevelop the vacant site, won't just increase tax base, it will bring vitality and support for what's already there. Let's see. Just to show you the transit resources, this is the site, and here's where the high-frequency bus transit is. It's about 2 to 3 blocks away. There's also bus lines on on Broadway, a couple blocks south. There's a nice ride bike station. There's the Mississippi East Bank Trail. There's bike lanes on Marshall south of Broadway, and they're being studied to go further north. So this also has the alternative transit areas, alternative transit resources that are synergistic with the density being proposed. This, Peter showed you this earlier. Here is the Greenbelt Activity Center. The point of me putting this up for you is that it is city goals to have areas of increased density throughout the city. And in the Northeast area, and particularly this part, this is one of the prime areas for that density to come. So it's sort of, if not here, where? And these are what the city policies are set up to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any questions for the applicant? Council President.
Ms. Lansing, so is the high frequency network, is that university? Is that where the bus?
No, I believe that's second.
Oh, it's second.
Second.
Oh, really?
University is here.
Oh, okay. So it's second. Okay.
This one's highlighted because it's within the area it needs to be for that 50% parking reduction.
And that's a high frequency network?
Mm-hmm.
So that's every 20 minutes on second, really? 15. One. Thanks.
Are there any further questions for the applicant? All right, would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Okay.
Thank you, Chair Bender and council members. My name is Pamela Lehan. I live at 1117 3rd Street Northeast. I've been in these chambers before for a similar building, and very similar situations are coming to mind. And I'd like to speak to the parking issue. Unless you live in the area, you may not see all of the parking congestion that goes on in Northeast. And I don't want to see our businesses suffer as a result of not having that parking. It would be great if everybody that walked and rode a bus would go to those different businesses, but parking people are the ones that come in and help to support. Secondly, it would be wonderful if we could have public transit all over our city. We have a state that the legislature is voting down $1 billion in monies that are supposed to go to Metro Transit, and our state is being cut 40% for Metro Transit. And I feel we're putting the cart before the horse. We're building, and putting lots of density in, but how are we funneling it? What are we doing for the infrastructure for getting these cars in and out and people that need to take public transit? I can give myself as an example. There are seniors my age, and that percentage is rising in this city. And I have 9 grandchildren that live in 4 different directions, and buses don't always go to those directions, but I'm still going to go. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay.
Hi, my name's Heidi Sid Graspal. I would like to start by thanking Pat for looking for somebody to actually take care of Dusty's. I think a lot of us in the neighborhood do appreciate that. However, I also feel that this project doesn't totally fit into the neighborhood. As stated by other people, the people that are going to be renting those apartments are going to have cars. They are not going to be using public transportation all the time, and the parking is an issue. If you want the parking to not be an issue, then make these houses, these rentals, low-income houses or low-income rentals where the people will not have cars. But that's not what's happening. I just really feel it's out of place and that it's not fitting with the neighborhood. The neighborhood is traditionally known as being a working class neighborhood, and at this point, projects like this are kicking all those people out of the neighborhood, and it's really not fitting with the neighborhood. So that's my say. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Last call. Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. And so for this one, we have two items. It's item 1 and item 8. Or sorry, excuse me, item 2 and item 8. Do you want to start? Fry is here and would like to say something about the project.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of those that were here to speak and testify today. I do appreciate your time and your presence. To jump to the conclusion that I'd like to get to, I do think we're going to need a little bit more time, Madam Chair, to sort some of these details out and to negotiate something that functions and that is within all of the acceptable conditions. I would ask that there be a continuance of one cycle. But I would also like to speak to each of the individual issues. So I think what we are seeing here today, and actually with the Washington development that came just prior, is the constant push and pull that you have when anytime these developments come forward. There's first, I can tell you that when I first learned of this project, the first priority for me and my number one initial concern was the retention of Dusty's for the long haul. Although I haven't done my research on the historical significance of the building itself, I doubt that it is historic, which means that any subsequent developer that comes down the pipeline could potentially get rid of the business and then demolish what I deem to be a neighborhood legacy. And I would like to see Dusty's remain there for the long haul. So that was the first priority. So I think it's really important that as we look to see what the goals are of this project, that we're also considering what might come next if some form of this development ultimately doesn't come through. And I know that the neighborhood understands that. Second, I'll talk about the parking. And I do agree with the neighbors that there and some of the local businesses that at times there is a dearth of parking in the area, and as significant density goes up, I don't necessarily think that every single person there will be riding a bike or driving a car. I also believe that while the transportation network along 2nd Street is somewhat significant, we are fighting off attempts at the state legislature to reduce the budget for busing by as much as 40%, and that's something that we need to consider. Now, that being said, you can't argue for additional parking and simultaneously argue for affordability. Every additional parking space that's required to get put in does add to the per unit cost. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And if we're arguing for affordability, additional parking is quite simply not the way to go. And so I think we need to be looking at the push and pull of that dynamic. I think one individual, I believe it was Heidi, mentioned the possibility of having low-income or affordable housing there, and absolutely that would absolutely be something that I would consider for this location. And then finally, just to this overarching topic of gentrification and what are the things that we want to prevent moving forward. This is presently a surface parking lot. And what we know right now is that this neighborhood, because of the work of the association and the people that live in it, is rising very quickly in value. If we simply keep it as a surface parking lot, do not add any density, and I realize it's not the goal of the neighborhood not to add any density, but if we keep it as is, what will continuously happen is the demand will creep up while the supply remains stagnant. And that will do nothing but add to the values and ultimately displace people of lower incomes. So, and then I'll finally add the concept of live workspace. The concept that this is an activity center, and there's a request to be rezoned as C3A, would lead me to say, well, maybe there should be some retail or some aspect of activity in the building itself, and there's presently not. There's not. The belief that live workspace will be retail, I don't agree with. We've done live workspace in the past, and it just ends up being live space. And so I do have a concern about that. So at the end of the day, you can see that I do think that there is a compromise that can be struck here. We can retain Dusty's. We can keep some affordability in these apartments. We can account for some of the parking concerns of the businesses around the area and the residents, and I know they are there. And I think we can all do this hopefully within the next cycle or so. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn it back over to Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will concur with Councilmember Fry and the notion that could be some time put to good use, and I can vouch firsthand that this particular community group has a strong track record of working with developers and producing great projects that have added density and activity to the area. So I think they're here in good faith, and so I think it'll be time well spent. Just to comment on the historical nature of Dusty's, just as a personal note, I'm very, very relieved that Dusty's will remain in operation, not just because it's a quaint old building, but because as we're sitting here, I'm getting really hungry for a Dago, and there's only one place to get one, and it's the best burger in town, so in my opinion. So that's an important thing. But I don't know its current designation. I believe it may not be currently designated, but to say that it couldn't be, I think that might not be accurate, and I encourage staff to look at the designation for this particular building, and here's why. Again, it's not just nostalgia or a personal connection to it, or that it's a quaint little stack of bricks. This is part of the history of the Northeast Brewing District, period. As we know, the little pubs that go up throughout the fabric of Northeast Minneapolis aren't there just by accident. They're often sponsored by the brewers themselves. And this one in particular, it was sponsored by the obvious sponsor, Grain Belt. And so this is the one Tide House, the little pub, that's right across the street from its sponsor. It makes a visual connection to that historical connection that can't be replicated by the dozen other or so pub houses throughout Northeast and other liquor districts. There's Glick houses. Like Club Jaeger was a good example of a Glick, and I think we've even had some conversation about preservation of these these buildings that have that story. But none of them, the several dozen that are throughout Minneapolis that still exist, are right across the street from their sponsor. And I think that's very important to remember. So I think staff should explore that moving forward. But I do really respect the fact that someone's willing to preserve Dusty's not only as a building, but as an institution and the purveyor of that wonderful Dago.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad that we had the public hearing today, because I learned something in the public hearing that I would just like to throw out there for whatever negotiation happens from here to there. And that is the young lady that got up and pointed out that there is no other C3A zoning in the entire sector. And I think that says something. I have an activity center in my ward, and it's not zone C3A either. And so it seems to me as though this is a case of empty lot, what's our pro forma that will fit, not what fits best within the neighborhood. I'm not sure how else, if that was, it's so obvious to me actually that that's the case. This block doesn't have C3A, then you do a ring around it, there's no C3A, then you look at the entire planning sector, there's no C3A. They decided what they wanted to build, and they determined what the zoning was going to be, and they came in and said the city wants density, do it here. And I really reject that idea that they should just do whatever they want because we want density. They should do something here. I agree. I think it's better than a surface parking lot without question. But it has to be something that fits in, if not to the existing zoning, then similar zoning within the area. I think that makes the most sense. I also would urge us to look at designating Dusty's. Certainly Councilmember Fry could suggest that designation, then we won't have to be worried about what developer comes in the future and potentially threatens to tear down Dusty's unless they can get a 6-story building. So I do think that we should be looking at suggesting Dusty's as a potential building for designation anyway, so that we don't have to face in the future what would happen if this development doesn't happen with this pro forma, but it would be the baseline for what would happen going forward.
Okay, so I will go ahead and move to postpone this item one cycle to the next Zoning and Planning Committee meeting. I'll keep the public hearing. Oh, I closed the public hearing. So we'll go ahead and reopen a public hearing next time as well. And I do want to remind everyone who spoke to please check in with the clerk and sign in, please. We have some of you, but not all, who spoke. I'll just mention too, I spoke about this at Planning Commission, and I look forward to seeing the changes that come forward from more time with the developer and the neighborhood organization. I do think it's important to note that we have one of the lowest rental vacancy rates in housing in the country right now. And so every single time we look at a project, we are deciding whether or not we're going to address and allow for more housing in our community, or if we're going to maintain this dysfunctionally and dangerously low rental vacancy rate. And what that really means is it doesn't mean people are going to stop moving to the neighborhood. It means the choice between people moving into a new building or moving into an older building and displacing current residents. And we've seen that in city after city after city across the country. So I'm excited to hear that the neighborhood organization has a history of being supportive of new housing in the community, because we do need it. And we have these areas of the city called activity centers that we've left lower zoned. It means that we do have to rely on more rezonings every time. So the other policy choice would be to rezone our activity centers to a higher zoning. Then we would have less discretion each time. It would look like we were allowing less rule breaking because our rules would be more consistent with our policies. So all that said, I again look forward to seeing the changes come forward, and that is so we'll go ahead and vote on postponement of items 2 and 8. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? There's carry. That's our last item, and we are adjourned. Thank you.